Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pala, and welcome back to a new episode of Dpen Crimes. Today, as always, I've done my homework, read a lot, and uncovered some new information, things I didn't know before and had never come across. It's clear that there's always new material to discover, which makes studying this case even more fascinating. I want to clarify that I'm not an expert, just an enthusiastic amateur, so to speak. I've suggested two, or maybe three, possible reconstructions, just to better contextualize the matter. At the end of this series, we'll do a brief recap of all the reconstructions we've explored. Today, we're focusing on two reconstructions of the mystery, imagining different scenarios, because, in reality, there are many possibilities. The first reconstruction today is what we can define as the official one. What do I mean by official? I'm referring to the latest ruling on the case. However, it's not that straightforward. According to the latest verdict, Rudy Guede participated in the murder, while Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito did not, or at least there isn't enough evidence to assert that they were actively involved, even though they were present in the house. Now, let's analyze this hypothesis and see if Rudy Guede could have committed the murder on his own. In this analysis, I'm helped by a dear listener, a true friend, who found a book for me that I struggled to obtain. I finally got it for free, even from the New York Police Department, titled The Forgotten Killer. This book, available only in English, offers a very specific, structured, and clear reconstruction of how, according to the authors, the murder of Meredith Kercher took place. Find this reconstruction particularly effective, so we'll examine it together to better understand what might have happened that night. As I mentioned, I'm aided in this analysis by a dear listener, a true friend, who found a book for me that I had trouble getting. I finally obtained it for free, even from the New York Police Department, titled The Forgotten Killer. This book, available only in English, offers a very specific, structured, and clear reconstruction of how, according to the authors, the murder of Meredith Kercher occurred. Let's take a step back. After the initial trial and the conviction of Amanda Knox, there was a huge media frenzy, especially in the United States, where various support groups formed for her. This case caught the interest of many people and experts, including Douglas Preston and John Douglas, the authors I mentioned earlier. These two writers began investigating the case, and, as revealed in all the rulings from the Italian courts, especially the latest one, they realized there were serious problems with the investigation. In particular, there were significant deficiencies, like the lack of proper protocols during the crime scene inspection. For instance, gloves weren't always used or changed, and shoe covers weren't utilized. These mistakes compromised the integrity of the collected evidence. To clarify, one of the authors is an investigator. I don't recall exactly which one, but that detail is minor, while the other is a friend of Amanda's family. In fact, Douglas Preston's daughter was classmates with Amanda Knox in high school. Together, these two authors developed a plausible reconstruction of the events that, in my opinion, deserves attention. Their theory, which certainly has its limitations, is based on the idea that all the evidence points directly to Rudy Guede as the sole perpetrator of the murder. However, before delving into the details of this reconstruction, I want to make a clarification that I consider fundamental. Neither the authors of the book nor the other individuals involved in its writing had direct access to the case evidence. This means they could not physically analyze the evidence, collect it, or examine Meredith Kercher's body. Their theory relies solely on the materials they had access to, such as videos, audios, photographs, court rulings, and interrogation transcripts, along with press conferences and newspaper articles. I make this clarification because, while their theories might seem valid, it's important to approach them with caution, given the lack of direct verification. Another aspect that left me somewhat perplexed is the tone the book takes towards the Italian judicial system and police forces. While it's true there were mistakes made by investigators and the justice system in this case, the authors tend to portray the Italian police as if they were from a developing country. Americans sometimes have this tendency to want to teach the world how to do things, which can be a bit irritating. Although they certainly excel in many areas, this arrogance doesn't always serve them well. That said, I don't want to focus on critiquing the book, but rather discuss what their theory asserts. First, I'd like to present the author's theory without interruption. Then, I'll comment on the parts where I think they got it right and the parts where I believe they missed the mark. The theory they propose is as follows. Rudy Guede arrives that night with a knife in his pocket and a tool for breaking glass, clearly intending to steal, not to kill or assault. He walks around the house to make sure it's empty. Rudy knew the tenants, though not very well, and he was aware that they likely weren't home. It was Halloween weekend, a time when many people were out of town. However, Rudy knew that an American girl and an English girl lived there who hadn't returned for the holidays. According to this reconstruction, Rudy moves through the garden and patio to ensure everything is calm. The house is a villa divided into two parts, an upper floor and a lower floor. Rudy decides to enter the second floor where the girl's apartment is located. In this theory, he throws a fairly large stone, about 25 to 30 centimeters long and weighing around 4 kilograms, from over 3.5 meters up, hitting a window precisely. The stone breaks part of the glass, and we'll later see how they justify the staging. After climbing in, Rudy finishes breaking the glass with his elbow, or the object he brought to gain entry. According to them, the thrown stone hits a cabinet, causing many items to fall to the floor, which could explain the mess in the room and partially account for the staging. Rudy enters the house through Filomena Romanelli's window. Once inside, he notices there's no one around. Everything is dark and quiet. At this point, for reasons not entirely clear, perhaps due to a surge of adrenaline, Rudy starts to feel anxious. Despite the presence of valuable items like a computer, a camera, and jewelry in Filomena's room, Rudy doesn't take anything. Instead, he feels the urge to use the bathroom. According to the reconstructions, Rudy had never been in that house before, so he moves around in the dark, trying to find his way. Keeping the lights off, he leaves Filomena's room and heads toward the large bathroom on the right. Theoretically, the bathroom on the left would have been slightly closer for Rudy, as it's near Amanda Knox's room on the left and across from Meredith Kercher's room, about 6 to 7 meters away, perhaps even less. However, Rudy decides to go to the farther bathroom, maybe looking for more privacy as he prepares to relieve himself. We've discussed at length this aspect of the infamous bathroom incident during his attempted robbery, likely triggered by anxiety. While he's in the bathroom, Rudy suddenly hears the front door open and recognizes Meredith Kercher's footsteps. At that moment, Rudy panics. He quietly gets dressed, careful not to flush the toilet to avoid making noise and drawing Meredith's attention. Additionally, he had the foresight to close the door to Filomena Romanelli's room before going to the bathroom, so Meredith wouldn't notice the broken window and the mess caused by the intrusion. Unaware of the situation, Meredith enters her room. At this point, Rudy has two options: quickly leave through the front door, just a few meters away, or confront Meredith. According to this reconstruction, he decides to attack her. He lunges at her, pulls out the knife, immobilizes her from behind, covering her mouth with one hand and threatening her with the weapon in the other. A struggle ensues. Meredith tries to defend herself, and during the fight, she sustains some bruises, particularly on her elbows, arms, and legs, though not many. Here lies one of the main issues I see in this reconstruction. Rudy somehow manages to subdue her, partially undress her, and attempt a sexual assault. While no semen from Rudy is found, epithelial cells are discovered in Meredith's vagina, suggesting intimate contact. During the attack, Rudy manages to keep Meredith restrained, and for some reason she puts up little resistance or makes very little noise. Eventually, Rudy kills Meredith. According to the book, it's not so much an accidental killing during a struggle, but more of a deliberate decision. Rudy realizes that Meredith has recognized him and would report him, so he decides to kill her. After the murder, Rudy goes to the bathroom to grab some towels, both to clean himself up and to try to tidy up the crime scene. Then, he tries to clean up the room as best as he can. An important detail is that, according to this reconstruction, Rudy doesn't leave through the front door of the house, because there are no traces of blood suggesting he went that way. Instead, it's assumed he climbed out through the window of Filomena Romanelli's room, though there are no traces of blood there either. Now, I've just given you the short version, but the book is much longer and far more detailed. Let's dive into the main issues I see with this reconstruction, starting from the very beginning. The book tries to counter every aspect, including the presence of the two towels found next to Meredith's body, providing an explanation for everything. My first problem with the idea of Rudy's robbery is the absence of gloves. The book tries to paint Rudy Guede as a modern-day Arsène Lupin, an experienced thief who supposedly committed dozens of burglaries. But in reality, there's only one attempted break-in and a couple of police reports on his record, hardly the career of a seasoned criminal. Plus, there's another thing that puzzles me. Why would Rudy pick a student house? Anyone who's ever seen a student house knows there's usually not much worth stealing. Sure, there might be some cash or a few valuables, but not a whole lot. Here's a detail I've never mentioned before, but is important. 300 euros, Meredith's credit cards, and her cell phones went missing from her room. This adds another layer of complexity to the reconstruction. If it really was a burglary, Rudy would have probably grabbed the computer, the jewelry, the camera, and even the 50 euros in cash that were in Filomena Romanelli's room as soon as he entered. He would have acted quickly, knowing that Amanda Knox and Meredith Kercher hadn't left for the weekend and could return at any moment. If I were going to rob a house, even knowing it was empty, I'd try to spend as little time there as possible. I'd go in, grab what I could, and leave, because the longer I stayed, the higher the chance of getting caught. But Rudy seems to take his time. He goes to the bathroom, stays there, almost like he's sure no one's coming back. This behavior is baffling to me. Why that particular house? It wasn't exactly a luxury mansion. Yet Preston and Douglas offer an explanation. They argue that, since it was the beginning of the month, Rudy knew the girls would be paying rent soon, and therefore there'd be cash in the house. In fact, Meredith had 300 euros for rent that was stolen, and there was cash around the house precisely for that reason. This theory makes some sense, but it feels a bit weak to me. Risking everything, including prison for 300 euros, even if it seemed like an easy target, just doesn't quite convince me. Although I admit, there's a certain logic to it. The second issue I have with this theory, which I find very relevant, has to do with Filomena Romanelli's statements. Filomena said that, having left her room tidy for 2 days because she had gone away for the weekend, she had closed the external shutters. She hadn't locked them with the hook since it was broken, but the shutters were closed. In a later interrogation, Filomena Romanelli said she wasn't sure whether the shutters were open or closed. Initially, she stated that the shutters were closed, but then admitted they might have been open. However, her initial impression was that they were closed. This is an important detail because it casts doubt on the entire reconstruction of how the break-in happened. This brings up a crucial question that many have asked. How could Rudy have thrown a rock at the window glass if the shutters were closed? The shutters should have prevented the rock from hitting the glass. It's true that, theoretically, the shutters could have opened because of the wind or some other reason, allowing Rudy to throw the rock. But this inconsistency still leaves room for doubt. If the shutters were indeed closed, how could Rudy enter through the window without leaving clear evidence or causing more damage to the shutters? The explanation involving staging is a central theme in the discussions about this case. The concept of staging refers to the intentional alteration of a crime scene to make it appear as if a different event occurred. In this specific case, the idea of staging comes from the observations made by Filomena Romanelli, one of Meredith Kercher's roommates. When Filomena returned to her room, she immediately noticed that despite the window being broken, nothing was missing. The computer, the camera, the jewelry, and the cash were all still there. This already seemed odd for a burglary, as you'd expect that something would have been taken. Another detail that raises suspicion is the position of the broken glass. Philomena observed that the glass shards were on top of the clothes, not underneath them. This suggests that the clothes might have been spread on the floor before the glass was broken, leading to the hypothesis that someone deliberately scattered the items to simulate a burglary and then broke the window from the inside to make it look like an entry from the outside. According to the theory presented in the book and other sources I consulted to understand this better, it suggested that the stone thrown by Rudy Guede hit one of the wooden window frames, changed direction, and grazed the window before breaking the glass. This detail is supposedly supported by the presence of a mark on one of the wooden frames, which some believe was caused by the rock. However, it isn't clear whether this mark was actually related to the thrown stone or if it was already there for some other reason. The reasoning goes that the stone thrown by Rudy Guede hit a wardrobe, an open one without doors, causing the clothes to fall. The window glass, once broken, then fell onto the clothes that were already scattered on the floor. Entonces, la explicación que podría tener sentido es que Rudy, después de romper el vidrio con la piedra, ya habiendo esparcido la ropa por el suelo, luego escaló la pared y mientras se trepaba, tuvo que romper los vidrios restantes en el marco de la ventana. Estos vidrios, al caer, terminaron sobre la ropa ya esparcida por el suelo. Esto podría explicar por qué los vidrios fueron encontrados sobre la ropa. So, the explanation that might make sense is that Rudy, after breaking the glass with the rock, having already scattered the clothes on the floor, climbed up the wall, and while climbing, had to break the remaining glass in the window frame. As these pieces of glass fell, they ended up on the clothes already spread across the floor. This could explain why the shards were found on top of the clothing. Are there any pieces of evidence that confirm this theory? One of the common questions is whether tests were done to verify the distance and force required to throw the stone. I haven't found concrete information about if or how these tests were conducted. I also haven't been able to obtain details about fingerprints found on the stone or the window. It's possible that analyses were carried out, but if so, the results haven't been made public or clearly documented. Another issue is the logistics. Moving a 4-kilogram rock in a context like this could be tricky. To give you a clearer idea, it might be helpful to see a photo of the location. I'll include this image in the podcast description. And please, feel free to write to us on our Instagram profile, and we'll share it with you. Have you ever thought about how a theory can seem plausible until, when you start examining the details, contradictions emerge? For example, imagine a really large, heavy stone. It's hard to believe that someone could throw it with enough precision and force to hit such a specific target. I also have my doubts about whether this was possible. Furthermore, there's another aspect that makes this theory less convincing. There were no glass fragments on the ground below the window, and considering that it had rained in the days leading up to this, you'd expect to find traces of mud on the wall. The wall, in fact, was very smooth and low, without many footholds. If someone had climbed it with wet shoes, they should have left muddy prints. However, there weren't any such prints, none at all. This, in my opinion, is one of the major issues. And there's another detail that adds to this. It's said that the suspect went to the bathroom during the incident. In the book, it actually cites statistics showing that during a burglary, it's quite common for the burglar to step away for a moment. I've checked these statistics, and they turned out to be accurate. But still, it's these small inconsistencies, the absence of mud, the missing glass fragments, the logistics of throwing the stone, that make me question how it all really went down. The tension and emotions that someone experiences in a high adrenaline situation can often lead to physical reactions, like vomiting or needing to use the bathroom. This could explain why the suspect might have gone to the bathroom during the robbery. However, there's something about this explanation that doesn't sit right with me. They describe the suspect as an expert, almost an Arsène Lupin, who had committed similar robberies many times before. If it had been one of his first times, I could understand the need to stop at the bathroom due to stress. But, as I keep repeating, I just can't imagine a thief breaking into a small, modest house with only 5 minutes to grab what they can and leave, deciding to stop and use the bathroom. though I suppose there is some logic to it. Another thing that, in my opinion, doesn't make sense is Rudy's behavior according to the reconstruction. If I were in the bathroom and heard someone coming into the house, meanwhile, you can check out the house layout, I would panic. If I heard someone moving around in the other part of the house, my first thought would be to find the safest exit. I'd go straight for the front door to get out. He saw the door as he passed by the large bathroom. It was right there. So, the most logical thing would be to escape through that door, especially because if someone entered, they most likely would have left the keys inside. I'd turn the key and leave. If I were a thief, the first thing I'd think about would be to escape. I wouldn't be trying to attack someone with a knife. My priority would be getting away as quickly as possible, not escalating the situation into violence. If I were a thief, my main goal would be to avoid being caught and to escape without leaving any traces. Attacking the victim, restraining them, or even attempting sexual assault wouldn't seem like a sensible move, given that these actions would massively increase the risk of being identified and captured. Even though there are explanations that might seem logical, like the idea of reducing the risk of being discovered, I can't find a logical connection between committing a burglary and carrying out a violent assault. If the goal is simply to get money, why restrain the victim, threaten them, attempt sexual assault, and ultimately kill them? To me, it just doesn't make sense. There are crimes that seem too different from each other to fit together easily. If we consider a situation where a thief breaks into a house, finds a victim alone, and decides to assault them, it seems unlikely to me that they would act as described. Imagine the thief, panicking, loses their head, and doesn't think about escaping. They could find themselves in a situation where the victim has their back turned, maybe while arranging their bag or changing clothes. In that scenario, the thief might try to attack them from behind with a knife. But the sequence of events described, threatening the victim, attempting a sexual assault, and then, finally, trying to clean up the blood with towels, seems inconsistent to me. What I find hard to accept is that the attacker, after committing such a violent crime, would take the time to clean up in a hurried manner and then leave. This sequence of actions just doesn't seem very believable. The other theory that this version attempts to prove, through the nature of the wounds, is that there was only one person responsible for the attack. However, I'm not convinced of that. Let me explain the perspective I've formed based on the preliminary autopsy, since a final autopsy isn't available online, and on research from various sources that discuss the case from both the perspective of Amanda and Raphael's innocence and their guilt. The experts who have analysed the body argue that the wounds suggest the presence of more than one attacker. The injuries on the body seem to indicate that the victim was restrained by someone, while others had more freedom of movement. On the other hand, those who believe there was only one assailant often have only seen photos of the body, without examining it in detail. Even the defense experts who examined the case never directly saw or worked with the body, which complicates the analysis of the wounds even further. The wounds are quite varied and difficult to interpret. For instance, there are very few defensive wounds, and this is a crucial point that hasn't been adequately addressed in the book I reviewed. If Guede was the only attacker, a question arises for me. Why? If he was trying to rape the victim and was threatening her with a knife, are there no signs of restraint? The victim had her hands free, yet there doesn't seem to be any attempt at self-defense. A significant element is that there were no traces of Rudy Guede found under the victim's nails, suggesting she did not physically fight back against him. Some marks on her body have been interpreted by this theory as signs of defense, but they seem more like signs of immobilization. These marks indicate that someone was holding the victim rather than her trying to free herself. The injuries on her wrists, arms, and legs appear to come from someone attempting to restrain her, not from active self-defense. Therefore, the theory that only a single assailant was involved remains problematic, especially considering the absence of typical signs of struggle. While discussing this, I came across an article that attempts to explain, using photos, how it's possible that only one person was involved in the crime. Supporters of this theory claim that since Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito had already been arrested along with Rudy Guede, it was necessary to frame the narrative in a way that involved 2 or 3 individuals to explain everything that happened. However, I disagree with this interpretation, but I'll explain why this theory was formulated. The physical and biological evidence primarily points towards Rudy Guede. As I mentioned before, the key pieces of evidence indicate his presence in the house, which raises questions about the validity of the evidence linking Amanda and Rafael to the crime. There are only a few pieces of evidence that seem to connect Amanda and Rafael, like a footprint initially thought to belong to Amanda, but later excluded. The measurements didn't match Rafael's either, and the evidence against him is minimal. That said, the hypothesis that Guede could have committed the crime alone should not be completely ruled out, even though the reconstruction of the case presents significant flaws. The idea that Guede could have been the only attacker is not without merit, but the overall explanation has many gaps. Regarding the explanation of the feces, we know that Guede had used the bathroom before the murder. This is important because if he hadn't done so before the crime, he would have likely left traces of blood in the bathroom, which were not found. Therefore, we can conclude that at least at one point during the night, Guede was in the house while Meredith was still alive. Supporters of the theory that Rudy Guede was the sole attacker try to explain why only his fingerprints and biological traces were found at the crime scene, with no signs of Amanda Knox, Rafael Solicito, or any third parties. One of the most controversial aspects of the case is that the crime scene only shows traces of Rudy Guede, without any evidence of Rafael, Amanda, or anyone else being present. This raises a crucial question. Why are only his fingerprints found at the scene, and none from others? Advocates of the theory that Guede was the only perpetrator must explain the lack of evident signs of struggle. If Guede was the only attacker, why doesn't the victim show any scratches or signs of defense? Think about this. In a high-tension situation like an attempted rape and a knife attack, you would expect the victim to leave signs of resistance. If someone is trying to subdue another person, there are typically clear signs of struggle, like scratches, kicks, or attempts to defend oneself. Picture a victim who, while being stabbed, tries to defend herself or escape. She should have obvious defensive wounds. Another theory is that if there had been 2 attackers, they would have had enough time to thoroughly clean the crime scene. This idea was also put forth by Mignini, who suggested that the alleged accomplices had planned everything in advance and then wiped away their traces. However, this explanation seems complicated, and there are significant gaps in the reconstruction of the crime. Many experts, including forensic biologists, have pointed out that the crime scene was so chaotic and there was so much blood that distinguishing Guede's specific traces from those of others would have been extremely difficult. This has sparked intense debate about the possibility of selective cleaning of the evidence. In fact, some experts have concluded that it would have been nearly impossible to identify and clean the traces with such precision. Another important point is the absence of Amanda's fingerprints in the house. It's interesting to note that, despite Amanda living there, there is very little evidence linking her to the crime scene. This is a topic we will explore in more detail in the next episode, but it's worth mentioning how Rudy Guede, during his interview with Franca Leosini, raised this question himself. Guede pointed out that there were no fingerprints of Amanda's in her own room, which raises questions about how they might have been cleaned. I won't tell you yet what I think happened, partly because I don't have a definitive answer, but it's clear that the theory claiming Rudy Guede acted alone has significant gaps. It's not a theory to dismiss outright, but it certainly doesn't answer all the questions raised by the case. I believe that even though there are many aspects that don't completely convince me or remain unclear, there is a possibility that Rudy Guede was indeed the sole attacker. Now, imagine this scenario. Meredith comes home and doesn't go straight to her room, but decides to stay in the living room or the kitchen, maybe to prepare something. Guede, who has been hiding in the bathroom, could stay there for 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour. If Meredith doesn't move away, he could seize the opportunity to come out, confront her, and take her to her room to carry out the attack. This scenario could explain why Guede didn't flee immediately after the robbery, but had to confront Meredith instead. How he entered or exited the house remains a mystery, and the wounds might suggest that Meredith, overwhelmed by panic and fear, couldn't defend herself as she normally would. It's also possible that, due to the severity of the initial blows, Meredith was unable to react, losing a lot of blood and lacking the mental clarity needed to fight back. Some studies indicate that if a victim receives a deep, bleeding wound, they can become immediately incapable of resisting. This might explain why there are minimal or almost non-existent defensive wounds. In conclusion, many questions still remain unanswered, and there are several reconstructions to consider. In the next episode, we'll address the final questions and delve into more details. For now, I want to thank you for joining me. Feel free to share your theories on social media. Good night, everyone. Take care.